the biblical world can be divided into two parts. And I've labeled, for the sake of our study tonight, I've labeled those two parts milk and honey. And that's the name of our lesson for tonight, milk and honey. I need to say a little bit about that. Mentioned frequently in the Bible together. Halav udavash. Halav udavash. Milk and honey. Now, if you look at that concept in the Middle East, it comes across in a little bit different picture than I had imagined. When I grew up, a land flowing with milk and honey suggested to me a very fertile, rich, blessed land. So when I traveled out to northwest Iowa to go to college, I would have said, this is like a land flowing with milk and honey. Look at the corn here, look at the whatever. In the Middle East, that's really not the image. It was a richly blessed land, and you can see that blessing in the word flowing with. Because if the land flows with milk and flows with honey, it's the flowing that indicates the richness of the blessing. Milk, to a Middle Easterner, sure, is an evidence of God's blessing, but milk is the product of the shepherd. Shepherds produce milk by their flocks. Didn't have cows to speak of much. You read about them occasionally in the Bible. But the word cattle in our English Bible most often means small domesticated animals and probably referred to sheep and not cows. Milk was the product of the shepherd. Honey, or davash, was the product of the farmer. So a land flowing with milk and honey, the milk and honey part of that phrase, was not so much a reference to the richness of the blessing. That I said you could find in the word flowing, at least in the Jewish mind. A land flowing with milk and honey is a land where the shepherd and the farmer can both live. And that's unusual in the Middle East. Most countries are either milk countries or davash countries, honey countries. In the case of Israel, God said, that land will support both the milk production and the honey production. And so the Jew looks at that image and asks, which part of the country is the milk and which part of the country is the honey? And that's one of the things I'd like to look at tonight. The second thing is that honey is not what I thought it was. There are two kinds of honey referred to in the Bible, I believe, and two kinds of honey referred to as davash in the Middle East to this day. By the way, most Middle Easterners love honey, maybe culturally because they didn't have the sweeteners that we're used to. And I've never met an Israeli or an Arab, I haven't asked all of them obviously, but I haven't met one that I happened to ask who didn't just love honey. We often send honey back with our friends who come to visit because that to them is such a wonderful thing. But there are two kinds of honey. There's bee honey, which is the same as you're used to. But the much more common honey is probably better translated by the English word jam. It's produced primarily from the figs and dates and fruit trees of the land of Israel. And it is very likely, I'll show you why, it is very likely that the honey of the Bible, when it talks about flowing with milk and honey, does not first and foremost refer to bee honey, but refers rather to jam, produced a sweet, jelly-like substance produced from the fruit of the figs, dates, and other kind of fruit trees to a lesser degree. Now, why do I say that? Well, I think there's two reasons why that's the Jewish tradition. By the way, it's not my opinion. That's totally the Jewish tradition, that that honey rather usually referred to jam. The first reason is that in Deuteronomy chapter 8, not even sure I put that up here, but in Deuteronomy chapter 8, God describes the 8 species. God says when you get to the promised land, there will be 8 species. You can look it up sometime. They include olives, figs, dates, wheat, barley, olives, figs, dates, wheat, barley, grapes. But the 8th one is honey. And it's the only one that's not a crop that's grown out of the ground, if it's bee honey. So the Jewish scholars, all the way back probably to the time of David, or to the first temple at least, said that 8th species has got to refer to the fruit from fruit trees out of which honey is made. So already at the time of Hezekiah, when people came to Jerusalem on Pentecost to bring their offering to God, they had to bring the 8 species. And one of those 8 species was figs and dates, out of which honey, jam, was made. And on that basis, the Jewish scholars said, you see, honey can't be bee honey because it's got to be parallel to the other 7. If that's not persuasive, you should look up sometime Isaiah chapter 7. In Isaiah 7, Isaiah said to the people of Israel, when the king of Syria comes, he's going to turn this land of milk and honey into a land of milk. Now, when you first read that, that seems kind of odd. What kind of a curse is that? To turn the land flowing with milk and honey into a land of milk. To the Middle Easterner, to the Jew of the time, that meant he was going to so totally destroy the farms and cut down all the olive trees and smash all the fruit trees that the only thing it would be good for was to pasture flocks. And therefore, it would no longer be a land of milk and honey, it would be a land only of milk. And that is a big curse. Okay? On those 2 bases, as well as other scripture passages, the Jewish belief is that a land of milk and honey refers to a land where the shepherd can live and where the farmer can live, and honey in that case, in their opinion, refers not primarily to bee honey, although there are occasions like Samson when it does, but refers rather to the sweet jam made of the figs and dates particularly, as well as from some other things. Now, if then we understand milk to be the land or the product of the shepherd, and honey to be the product of the farmer, and we look at the map, you'll notice something. And that is that the land of Israel can be very clearly divided into 2 regions. Thank you. If we divide it like this, we can say that the area to the east and to the south, in other words, this territory here, is the land of the milk. That's the shepherd's country. That's the wilderness. Desert, we might say, although I really question our use of the word desert because I think in English desert means something quite different, as I hope we'll see tonight. And this area here, if we end the country like this area here is the land of the honey, or the land of the farmer. And you can very clearly make a dividing line. In fact, if you really wanted to make that dividing line completely correct, you would actually put it on this side of the Dead Sea and the Jordan River, and say that everything to the right of that line is the land of milk, and everything to the left of that line, is the land of honey. Some Jewish scholars, I just read it again this week, refer to this as the left stage of God's people and the right stage of God's people. By right stage, they mean the land of the milk, and by left stage, they mean the land of honey. Now, I did a survey not too long ago. There are 350, I forgot the exact number. It's between 350 and 360 cities that are mentioned in the Bible. Of those 350 plus, only 50 of them are in the land of honey. Over 300 of them are either right on the border, like Jerusalem and Bethlehem, or they exist in the area we might call the land of milk. In other words, a significant portion of the life of God's people was happening or happened on the milk side of the stage on which God put His people. Now, what I'd like to do is to break that down and to look at each one of them. And we'll just very briefly review it because I'd like to take you to the place and actually look at some of the places where the milk and honey is produced. If we say the land of milk is the wilderness to the south and to the east, as we drew it on the map, there are 2 things, I think, that clearly come across from Jewish tradition as they understand the Bible. The land of milk is the place where people go to learn faith. Because in the land of milk, it's very clear you don't survive without the direct blessing of God. It's impossible to survive in the land of milk unless God feeds you and God gives you water. And that's clearly understood. So the people who went to the south and the east, the people who went to the desert, went in order to learn faith. Because that's the place you establish faith, you find God and you find faith, it was a place that people often went to prepare before they did something for God. So Moses, before he led the Israelites out of Egypt, spends 40 years in the land of milk, the desert. The Israelites, 40 years before they go in to take over the land, they prepare in the land of milk. Jesus, 40 days before he begins his Messiah work, goes out into the land of milk and spends time in relationship with God and strengthening himself and resisting, fighting the temptation that must have come across, that came across so clearly to become the Messiah in some other way. Now, that's what I'd like to look at first. I'd like to look at what does it mean to live in the land of milk. The land of honey, on the other hand, is clearly in the Bible a place where God rewards faith with prosperity. You move out of the place where you knew every single day if God didn't send manna, or God didn't turn stones into bread, or God didn't bring water out of the rock, you weren't going to make it. And then you say, now, I'm totally dependent on God. I'm standing on Him. I'm holding on to Him. God said, okay, if you've got a tight hold on my hand, now go on in there to the land of honey, because in the land of honey is where you're going to influence the world, because that's where the road is. As long as you're out here in the land of the milk, you're not going to do a whole lot. But if you'll go to the land of the honey and keep trusting me, you'll make a difference in your world. The problem for the people of God, and I think it's such a powerful theological concept, is once you get to the land of prosperity, now you're in interaction with the world. Now you're called upon to make a difference in your world. And the key question is, can you keep a hold on God's hand? Do you still believe that if God didn't give you what you needed right now, you wouldn't make it? And Israel was constantly tempted to think that there was another way or another reason that they were prosperous. And that reason for the Israelites often was they bought into the pagan cults, which seemed to work so well. And because that pagan system worked so well, and they couldn't any longer feel so tightly bound to God, and their farms were so fertile, they constantly felt themselves sucked into the values of their world. And as a result, even though God put them here, they made absolutely no impact on their world whatsoever because they were no different. Now, I heard a lecture one time from a Jewish rabbi who was lecturing on exactly this point. And he made the point that when you're out in the classroom of faith, there's no doubt you need God. And he talked about his ancestors coming out of the Holocaust and knowing that they only by the grace of God had survived. Then his ancestors, those who came before him, came to the United States. They became wealthy. They became successful. And many of them no longer felt that close relationship of trust because everybody knows I have a bank account and I have Social Security and I have life insurance. Why do I need God? Now, to me, that's a remarkably practical concept. Because the only way I will influence my world is if I go live out there. I have to live out there. The problem is, when I live out there, God blesses me. And I get all this stuff. I've even got a house in Hamilton. Can you believe it? I mean, like up on Society Hill, just south of Hamilton. It's a nice place. It's tough to wake up in the morning and say, God, every breath I take today, I depend totally on you, so I'm just going to hang on to you all day long. And as a result, it's very easy for me to buy into the pattern of my culture, which suggests I can do it myself. And as a result, trusting my own strength, I have very little impact. Now, what I'd like to do then is to first go to the land of milk with you and to talk about how did God teach His people in the classroom of faith to trust Him. What were some of the things that God taught His people? And then in future sessions to ask, now that they learned to trust and they went out into their world and interacted with other cultures and other value systems, what happened to them? So let's start very briefly then tonight with the land of milk. There are two wildernesses, two areas of wilderness that figure prominently in the Bible. And again, your map is on page 5, and I'd like to show you those two wilderness areas. One is right here along the Jordan River, all the way along the Dead Sea, like this, and then on this side as well. I won't draw that all on, but the wilderness begins right along what we said last time was the Rift Valley. We should have reviewed that tonight, but we'll do that next week because we had to do that political thing at the beginning. This is called the Judea Wilderness, or the Judah Wilderness. Wilderness of Maon is a small part of it. Next week we'll look at that wilderness. That's where Jesus was tempted. That's where David ran away from Saul. The area down below the Dead Sea is also wilderness, and that's called the Negev. The Negev. The south, or the dry country. And that's where I'd like to go first. So tonight we'll go to the Negev, and next week we'll go to the Judah Wilderness, and we'll always be asking, what did God teach His people that was necessary to understand to learn faith? Now, the Negev, among other things, is the place where Abraham was. He was at the edge of where the farm country begins, but he was in the Negev. It's where Israel wandered for 40 years. It's where Elijah ran away from Jezebel. In part, David was there also, whereas the Judah wilderness next week was David, Jesus' temptations, and according to the Bible, the place the Messiah would come from. And we'll focus on that next time. Now, very briefly again, and I'm rushing through this because I want to get to the other material. The Negev in particular, where Abraham, Israel, and Elijah went, was to the Jew the greenhouse out of which Israel came. Think about it. Abraham, the father of the nation, was a Negev wilderness person. The Torah was given to Moses in the Negev, in the Sinai, to the south of the Negev. The tabernacle came out of the desert. The Levites, as priests, came out of the desert. The Sanhedrin, which was so prominent in the New Testament, originated when Moses appointed the 70 elders in the desert. Moses himself was a desert person. The 10 Commandments came out of the desert. The concept of blood sacrifice came out of the desert. David, the king who established the political status and the figure of the Messiah, came out of the desert. In other words, a large percentage of what God's people thought they were about was formed and shaped in the desert. And often, if you read your reading assignment for this week, the prophets said things like, "Your love as a bride as you followed me in the wilderness," recalling how faithfully Israel had tracked after God in the desert, at least some of the time. Or again, Jeremiah, "Oh, to be in the desert." How much better that would have been, because that's where our roots were. Now, with that in mind, let's go then tonight to the Negev in the south part of Israel, and I'll show you where we will be. We're going to start over here. Check for sure where that first slide takes us. Okay, we're going to start over here near Beersheba. And if I would draw a circle, I can't quite draw it because I don't have enough room. But if I would draw a circle that big from Beersheba here, south, I go into the area called the wilderness of Zin. We say in English the wilderness of Zin because we don't have the tzadi in English that the Hebrew does, so we say the wilderness of Zin. Not the wilderness of Sin, that's another place. The wilderness of Zin. And in the Jewish understanding, and I think they're mostly correct, at least at this point, if you took the 40 years of Israelite wandering, at least 35 of those 40 years, they never left that circle. Now, I don't know if that surprises you at all. It shocked me. I thought they covered hundreds of miles. They were in a circle from here to Grand Rapids, and they were in that circle for 35 years. Some say it's because none of the men would stop and ask directions. That surprised me because I had imagined that they covered much, much larger areas, moving much more often than what they must have. So what I would like to do is to start near Beersheba and to head across, all the way across the wilderness, and end up down here at a place called Avdat, and in the process ask, what did God do to teach His people about faith and about trust, preparing them to move into the land of honey. Kathy, I'm going to make a request just in the interest of time here. I'm looking at the time, and time goes so terribly fast in this thing. Can we just switch to the other reel of slides right away? If we could just do that, I would appreciate it, and we'll do this immediately, and I'll show some of those next week. I'd like to start here and go across to the wilderness of Sin. Across the wilderness of Sin, asking what did God teach His people as they went. Now remember, most of this teaching will be in the form of pictures, because that's how God taught His people. An awful lot of the biblical psalm images, by the way, that I had imagined, we can have the lights turned off, that I had imagined coming out of the fertile part of the land are actually desert images. Okay, we're very near Beersheba, and we're going to start south into the land called the Negev. And Kathy, just a little bit of focus if you could. The Negev is very barren. It's really remarkable to imagine that the children of Israel spent 40 years in land like this. I never would have imagined how barren, and those of you that have been there can relate to that, how much nothing there is there. It's also much more mountainous than I had imagined. Often mountains with layers like this, and a whole mountain ridge, and then a flat open area, and then another great big mountain ridge, and then another flat open area. It was extremely rugged territory. And if you look at the time of the Israelite wanderings, no matter whose numbers you use, if you use the real conservative theology figures or you use other figures, the more liberal ones, you're still talking about thousands of people packed together in a relatively small area in extremely hostile conditions. Now, in the desert, there are three kinds of trees that grow, and I want to show you those three kinds of trees because every one involves a biblical image. These small shrub-like trees that grow fairly much out in the open where there's an area protected from the wind are called broom trees. And I'll show you the others in just a minute if I can get this thing to go in the right direction. There we go. Again, the Negev. Very mountainous, extremely dry, not particularly sandy like I think of when you think of desert. You get a mountain ridge and a flat open area, and to walk, I've walked across this area a couple of times, the whole distance of 40 miles. If you start here, walking across an area like that is an all-day undertaking. And then when you get to the far side, really there's nothing there but another mountain ridge to climb. Very little water. In fact, really, other than the Bedouin who might live in the area, the nomads who live there, there's very little water between where we are near Beersheba and Avdat, that at this point is about 40 miles to the south. Extremely rugged. Now, the other kind of tree that grows there, and I'll tell you specifically about that in a later slide, are called acacia trees. And acacia trees grow along the bottom of these valleys called wadis. And I'm going to say some things about that as well. I just want to point them out. You never see an acacia tree except in a wadi. And you never see a broom tree in a wadi, in a canyon. Broom trees are always out in the open, and so each one of them served a very different function, and each one of them has a biblical image. Again, here are the broom trees. And somebody like Greg Holcomb is going to ask, well, how big are they? Those broom trees come up about to your knees. Once in a while you'll see a broom tree bigger than that, but broom trees tend to be very, very small. Now, believe it or not, the main danger in the desert, the most dangerous thing in the desert, besides lack of water, obviously, is floods. And that is surprising. Actually, in this particular area right here, we're a little bit south right now, this particular area gets less than 4 inches of rain a year, some places only 2 inches of rain a year, and yet almost every year, if not every year, there are Bedouin shepherds in the area who lose their lives in flash floods. And it never rains here. The reason that happens, if you think back to last week, we said the middle of the country is mountainous, very mountainous. And those mountains are limestone covered with a soil that does not absorb water easily. Those mountains get between 26 and 32 inches of rain a year, which is not that much different than what we get, but they get that 32 inches, 26 to 32 inches of rain mainly in 4 weeks in the fall and 4 weeks in the spring. When it rains in the mountains, it rains hard, and the mountains cannot absorb the water. Some runs to the east and down to the Rift Valley and Dead Sea. Some runs to the west into the Mediterranean. Some comes charging down out of these mountains to the south, goes down into the Negev desert, begins to cut steep canyons, and eventually finds its way with a left-hand turn if you're facing south, or an eastern turn down toward the Rift Valley, and some of it even runs back north to the Dead Sea. But that rushing water that comes down into the desert creates canyons called wadis. Now that's a word worth remembering. It's W-A-D-I. Technically it's an Aramaic word, an Arabic word, but it's a word in the Jewish translation. I was just reading the new translation of the Tanakh, which I highly recommend to all of you who'd like to read the way the Jewish people translate the Old Testament. I find it so much more picture conscious than what the English translations are. They've left the word wadi. Unfortunately, in English, often that word wadi is translated by the English word river. And that's a mistake. There really only is one river in Israel. There's another one today, but in the biblical times that's mentioned, and that's the Jordan. All the other references to rivers in the land of Israel refer to these dry stream beds that only have floodwaters in them when it rains. Now, this particular one is not too far from Beersheba. It has some walls across it that probably date back to King Herod's time. They were built there in order to hold the water so that that water could be used by the people who lived in the area. But I like to show this slide because here behind this wall you can see that what's built up is a layer of sand. When the water comes rushing down out of the mountains and washes through the limestone, it melts limestone. Not a lot, but it melts limestone. The result is a fine white silica sand that piles up along the bottom of these wadis. And other than on the Mediterranean seacoast, that is the only place in Israel that you find a deposit of sand. And that's very much a cultural understanding. Now, one day there was a rabbi, I think you know who he was, that told a story. It's a story that existed in his culture before he came along. He retold the story in a different application. It was about, in their language, a stupid man and a smart man. The stupid man, said the rabbi, built his house on the sand. Now, think about that. I always assumed that building your house on the sand was a bad thing to do. But my father's a builder. He will tell you that building on the sand is really a very good thing. It compacts well, it drains well. He would much rather build on the sand than over where that other college is in Grand Rapids, where it's all solid clay. And I worked there many a summer building that thing, and it's terrible. Sand, people, the thing that makes sand a bad place to build is that over time, these wadis become like this. And so to build your house on the sand is to build your house in one of these. Now, what do you think Jesus' audience did when he said, the stupid man built his house on the sand? Who would build their house in the middle of this? And your song that most of you learned, if you learned a song, if you were in church when you were little, you learned a song that said, and the rains came down and the floods came up, and it washed the house away. The smart man built his house on the rock, which is up above at the top. And that, to a Middle Easterner, is not an image of a sand dune like we have just to the west of us here. That is an image of the wadi. And they do get floods. Every year, Bedouin shepherds drown in those wadis. You get tremendous rainfall. When it rains like that, the water comes cascading down out of the mountains. And you'll go from a dry wadi, not a cloud in the sky. It hasn't rained there in a decade, and all of a sudden, in a minute, 12 or 20 or 50 feet of water come thundering down those wadis, carrying stones sometime as big as cars, and washing away everything in the process. Now, that dynamic makes the flooded wadis a major danger in the desert. Bedouin, when it rains, they claim that the old Bedouin can smell when it's raining 25 miles away. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they say. So when it rains up in Hebron, the Bedouin will go with the end of a barrel, just the end of a barrel. They used to use a drum, but today they use a barrel and a steel bar, and they hit that into the barrel with a bar. Boom, boom, and you hear it echoing down the wadis, and that says, it's raining, you better get out. That, people, became the background to the biblical teaching about waves and billows and floods. So when the psalmist says, rescue me, take my feet out of the miry clay, or rescue me because all the waves and billows are sweeping over me, I would have thought that reference was an ocean reference. But the waves and billows that sweep over people, a desert reference, because those are the things that happen when the wadis flood. Oops, going the wrong way. Those are the things that happen when the wadi floods, and so they originate in the desert. Now, eventually, wadis can become this size. And I don't know if you can even see this. Maybe we could focus it just a little bit. Right here are some of our students. We left them there. You can see the size of those wadis. Now, let me show you another biblical image that comes out of a wadi like this. You can climb down into a wadi. Often when you hike, by the way, if you run into an army patrol or you run into Bedouin who are there, they're very friendly. They always want to know if you have enough water and those kind of details. And then they will say to you, don't sleep in the wadi. Because if you go down in the wadi, that flood water may come when you're not even aware of it and may totally wash you away. I remember one night, I've never seen the floods come. I've seen after they came. I remember one night, many years ago, when we were backpacking, we were sleeping outside. We slept near a wadi like this, up near the top. And some of the group wanted to go down in. And the wiser ones among the group said, no, let's not do that. It isn't going to rain, whatever. That next morning, there was a thundering flood. There had been a thundering flood. We saw the tail end of it in that wadi during the night that you can't imagine. Just absolutely taking everything in its path. But people do go down in the wadis, particularly during the time when it doesn't rain. Now, in the bottom of the wadi, you will often find pools of water that have been left behind by the floods. Reeds grow, papyrus, and it looks like this. Now, a danger in that part of the country, in that part of the world, is that sheep led to this particular area by shepherds. Sheep are not the rocket scientists of the animal family. And sheep will go down into the wadi looking for pools of water like this, not being aware that it's the rainy season and it's a time of danger. The floods will come and wash them away. In contrast to that, the shepherds talk about quiet water. Well, in Hebrew or Arabic, it comes out as water of peace, peaceful water. Now, I've heard people interpret quiet water or peaceful water as water that isn't flowing, because sheep won't drink moving water. Well, I don't know whether sheep will drink moving water or not. But I can tell you in the Middle East that quiet water does not refer to water that is or isn't moving. That is not the issue. Quiet water means water that you can go drink, but because it's not in the bottom of a wadi, it's not water that could eventually get you killed because its location is dangerous. Now, I don't know if you can see the difference in that picture. That had quite a strong impact on me, because I would have guessed this is quiet water. It looks so idyllic and so peaceful. It's not quiet water. This water is in the bottom of a wadi, and if the shepherd is there, it's okay, because the shepherd will know when it's going to rain and when it isn't going to rain. If the shepherd isn't there, this is a dangerous location, because a sheep that's down in there looking for that pool of water may not have any concept that it's going to rain. The water comes and washes it away. So the psalm says, he leads me, the shepherd leads me to quiet water. Meaning, what the shepherd says I ought to drink not only satisfies my thirst, but it's safe in the process. I talk about that often with high school students in the classes I teach, because it seems to me that high school students generally, okay, let's not limit it to high school students, are the thirstiest people in the world. And I don't mean that literally. I'm not referring to alcohol or anything like that right now. They want to drink in life. But often what looks like it satisfies thirst, in the long run, is extremely dangerous. Not simply physically, but spiritually, emotionally, mentally. But you may not know that. And so I say to students, when you're drinking in life, go for it. God loves people who want to drink in everything they can find. You better pay attention to the shepherd who says, nope, this looks good. It may look like it satisfies thirst, but that is dangerous. Or, this is quiet water. Go ahead. Satisfy your thirst. Take what you want and what you need, because that won't hurt you in the process. And I like that image, which means I'm not always the best judge of what water out there is most helpful and what water is potentially dangerous. By the way, what I'm trying to do in a session like this is simply to go through a series of these pictures from biblical passages, show you what the Jewish understanding or the Middle Eastern understanding, sometimes it's Arab, sometimes it's Bedouin, understanding of that passage is, so that the picture you have fits to a certain extent the picture of the culture and at least gets you to think about it. Okay, let's go back to our trees. In the bottom of these wadis, acacia trees grow. Now, acacia trees have a couple of things that are somewhat unusual about them. One is that this particular kind of acacia tree, and there are several, by the way, there are several in Israel itself, but the desert acacia, the same tree that the Ark of the Covenant was made from, the acacia trees not only have very deep roots, but the acacia trees go through a long period of dormancy. That is, these particular acacia trees will grow in the bottom of this wadi, and there may be a decade where there's no floods whatsoever, so there's never any water in the bottom of the wadi. The tree will turn almost dead. You walk by the thing and the leaves are almost crinkly, and you look at that thing and you think, boy, that thing died. And then all of a sudden there'll be a rainfall somewhere, heavy enough, and there'll be a flash flood. Now, once in a while it'll even wash the acacia trees away, but usually the acacias grow just up out of the wadi, or in some place where the wadi gets a little bit wider, where there's a little bit more room, and they'll stand there. And within a couple of days of that water rushing through the wadi, that tree will come back to life. And the leaves get green. It will produce a flower. I'm not very good with colors, but I think it's kind of a pinkish color. And eventually it'll even produce a fruit. It's amazing to watch. And then, no more floodwaters. The water drains away. A couple days in the hot sun, it's gone. And a few weeks later, the tree goes back into dormancy, and there it stands again. Now, that, according to the Jewish understanding of the Bible, is what's referred to in Jeremiah 17 and also in Psalm 1. Jeremiah 17 says, the righteous person, the person who follows God's way, righteous person is like a tree planted by water streams. Now, this particular acacia tree is right where this wadi comes out of the mountains and heads down toward the Rift Valley. It's right in the middle of a wadi. That is not the picture I had in mind when I read about the tree planted by streams of water. I like to jog, and I jog out by the Rabbit River, and there are these enormous oak trees that grow right by the river. Have you seen that at all in the Allegan Woods? They are just beautiful, and you can see the roots actually coming down to the river. That was my picture. And I had a Jewish friend at the time I was studying here in the desert say to me, if the righteous person is like a tree planted by water, is that image? That means you always can see the water. And I thought about that, and I thought, you know, I think I like the Jewish understanding of that picture better. I think this, or, pardon me just a second, let me get it to back up one. Thank you. I think this is the tree planted by water. You see, I could ask you this question. Have you ever seen me read the Bible? Have you ever seen me pray? Well, you did at the beginning of the session, but on my own. Have you ever seen me go to church? In other words, have you ever seen me with my roots in the water? The answer is probably not for most of you. And yet, you ought to be able to look at me or look at yourself or have someone else look at you and say, now that person is a tree planted by water. Why? Because you can see the water? No, you can't see the water. The water is not visible. What you see is the tree. And the presence of the tree, alive and occasionally with blossom and fruit, is the proof that its roots are in the water. And that, people, is so Middle Eastern. It's so Jewish. We have a tendency as Greeks to think that the key is that we have our roots in the water. So we have this fixation, in a way, of being in church regularly, praying regularly, reading the Bible regularly, all of which is wonderful stuff. But sometimes we forget that the real point of all of that is that we bear fruit. And the fruit is not going to church, in my opinion. And the fruit is not praying mostly. That may be one fruit. The fruit is what I am as a person in response to what God wants me to be by His grace. And so it seems to me that I don't see the water, but I ought to see the fruit. And so I think that's a desert image that comes out of the psalm. Okay, next tree. Here's a broom tree. It's called a broom tree because the Bedouin break off these little ends, called rotem in Hebrew. They break off these little ends and use them for brooms. The way this tree enters the biblical imagery is that it provides in the desert shade. You'll notice as you look around, there's not a whole lot of shade anywhere. I mean, it's only this tree and the acacia tree in the bottom of the wadi and one other kind of tree that happens once in a while, but not much. In the desert, particularly in this part of the Negev, it gets extremely hot. And you can imagine that, 110, 120 degrees. The temperature range is enormous. That temperature will drop down very low at night. For somebody who's not used to it, it's extremely difficult to deal with it if you're living out in the desert. But in the daytime, when that sun reaches the point, the high point, that sun is so intense that if you're out in it for a while, especially bareheaded, somehow Americans who go to Israel, especially the students, don't want to wear hats. You know, it's crazy. In the class, all the guys want to wear their hat on backwards. You get to Israel and nobody wants a hat. But the sun is so intense that literally you'll get a pounding, driving headache. And so what you see of the Bedouin shepherds often is that when noontime comes or 11:30 comes and that sun has reached the point and it is getting so pounding hot, they'll find a cliff or a ledge somewhere that has a little shade. The sheep will lay near that shade sometimes. Sometimes the sheep will stay right out in the sun, and the shepherd will lay with his head under this tree. I've seen it. You come walking along, and there's a guy laying with his head, or a girl laying with her head under that broom tree. It's like they're dead. And you get closer, and they're not dead at all. They just crawled in, so they've got the top 18 inches from their head to their chest in the shade, and they're out of the hot sun. And that keeps them alive until the sun has moved over 2 o'clock and starting to cool off toward evening. The breeze picks up from the Mediterranean and it becomes cooler, and they can go back to being again a shepherd out in the sun. Now, in my opinion, based again on having learned the image of this in the Jewish context, that image comes in the Bible. I can think of 2 Bible stories immediately. One is Hagar. Abraham sends her away to die. He gives her son Ishmael and a skin of water and sends her out into the wilderness of Beersheba. And any person from that area will tell you he sent her to die because there isn't any water out there. She gets just far enough so her water skin is empty. She's dying of thirst, and she can't stand to hear her son crying, so she laid Ishmael in the shade of a broom tree, and she walked away till she couldn't hear him crying, and she went apparently in the shade of a broom tree and waited to die. And then God, of course, came and said, no, that's not the way it's going to be. The other biblical image is Elijah, who ran away from Jezebel, who was trying to kill him, or at least he thought she was trying to kill him. And he ran out into this desert, a day's journey south of Beersheba, which is almost exactly where this tree is. And he curled up under one of these trees and said, I've had it. I want to die. It's useless. And God said, get up and get down to Sinai. I got some stuff I want to tell you there. But again, he lays in the shade. Now, that image, I think, becomes a profound biblical image that has had great impact in my life personally. The image is this: the desert to a Jewish person in the biblical time is a metaphor for life. It's a good place to live. God provides day by day water and manna and food. But it's a place where it's hot and it's tough. But you can do okay. It's good. But every once in a while, noontime, that sun gets so hot that life becomes, at least for a time, unbearable. The Psalm says, the sun will not strike me by day. Very much echoing that metaphor that life sometimes, the sun can get so hot that you don't know how you will go on one single day. Now, I like to take people out into that desert, and the hotter it is, the happier I am. Because if you take a group of people and you sit under a broom tree like this, we usually sit under an acacia because there's only room for 2 under a broom tree, and you can't decide which 2. But when you say to people, think about your life. Think about the time when the circumstances happened and the heat was so intense that in your own heart you said, I don't think I can go on. I don't think I can live another minute. I don't think I can face another day. I don't think I can handle another crisis. And I know enough of you in the audience tonight to know that some of you have been there, and there are some of you who are there right now, where that sun is so hot that the only possible thing is a heat stroke. Now, honestly, as a Greek, what I wish God had said is that when that sun gets so hot, I'm going to send a cloudy day. Or I'm going to turn the sun away, let it shine somewhere else for a while. But that's not the picture. The picture that God paints in the desert is, I will be the shade at your right hand so that you can dwell in the shadow of the Almighty. And God says to me, when the sun gets so hot that it's almost unbearable, it is unbearable, look around. There'll be just enough shade, not to take away the sun, or even to make the heat go away, but there's just enough shade that you will handle, you'll be able to handle a minute at a time the sun. Now, I don't know if that means anything to you at this minute, but I think someday it will. Another way to look at it would be a wonderful exercise, and I've had some very wonderful blessing times in Israel to sit and to say, think about the time that you were in the sun. What was the shade that God gave you? The Lord is the shade at my right hand. People, that's a desert picture. And it says that when it gets hot and you don't know if you can make it, there'll be enough shade to keep going. Honest, right to the point. It won't make the sun go away, but it will give you enough strength to handle it a minute at a time. Interesting how often, by the way, that in the biblical mind of the Jewish people at least, the shade God provides comes in the form of other people. Here's another tree that grows in the desert. It's called in Hebrew arara. A''R''A'. Arara. It's translated in our English sometimes as bush. The Jewish translation of the word is Sodom apple. They call this a Sodom apple tree. But the Hebrew, and it's also in Jeremiah 17, the Hebrew is arara. Now let me tell you about the arara tree. I really like this tree. It doesn't grow very many places. You don't see very many of them. I've only seen 8 or 10 of them my whole life. But in the middle of that nothing desert, and you won't believe me that there's a desert. Well, there's a desert here. Can you see it? In the middle of that desert, here stands a tree. And it's green. And look at the fruit on that thing. I mean, you talk about in the middle of a desert where it hasn't rained in years and years and years, and there's nothing but dust and a broom tree once in a while. You haven't even been able to find a pool of water, no less a spring, and look at, here you run across one of those trees. And look at the fruit on that thing. It's about the size of your fist. It's about the size of a good-sized orange. And I love it when you find that, because you take one of those off of there and everybody gathers around thinking, boy, I wonder if this thing is edible. Does that ever look good? When you break open an arara, there's a little sound and you get a puff of dust. And the puff of dust is the pollen or the whatever that's inside, and there's a tiny little pit just a little bigger than a raisin, and the thing is completely empty. And there is nothing in it. In fact, the juice of the skin, they say, is highly poisonous. The Bedouin use it in some different ways. There's nothing in it. Now, this is what Jeremiah says. Listen, same passage where it talks about the righteous man like a tree planted by streams of water, which I think is the acacia tree. Jeremiah says, the unrighteous person is like a bush, in English, like an arara in the desert, in a salt land where no one can live. And the image is the unrighteous, the ungodly, that person who doesn't follow or trust, this is the Bible's image now, is like this kind of a tree. They look wonderful. They're successful. They're attractive. They're popular. They're well-liked. And, says the passage, when you break them open and look inside, they're empty. And there's nothing there but dust. It's powerful. It's really powerful because I think we live in a culture where that outward appearance of what people are like is so important. We put so much stress. We notice it so much. And Jeremiah says, yeah, you think the successful, the popular, the well-liked person who doesn't want anything to do with God is good. He or she is like an Aurora in the desert. And we say a bush in the desert, and boy, did that ever lose the picture, because the idea is it looks good, but there's nothing in it. You understand why they call it Sodom apple. Lot left Abraham, left this land of the shepherd, this desert area. He's up near Bethel, where the Judea wilderness is. And he looks at Sodom, and he said, that looks good. And when he got there, what was inside was really nothing. Or maybe it was death. Some say the poisonous part of this is part of why the name came. It's a real object lesson. It's one of those powerful lessons. And Jeremiah lived, by the way, at a place called Perat, which is at the edge of the edge of the Judea wilderness, where there are a number of these trees growing yet to this day. And I have an idea that Jeremiah sat out one afternoon and wrote Jeremiah 17 and compared the acacia tree down at the bottom of Wadi Kelt with the Aurora tree, which also grows along the bottom of Wadi Kelt. And you read Jeremiah 17 once. It's a really fascinating passage. Okay. The people who live in the milk part of the land, by the way, about 75% of the land is the milk part, are called the Bedouin. And I'm just going to give you just a quick run through. We haven't got time to talk so much about the Bedouin. In the Bible, they're called Midianites or Amalekites. Amalekite is a tribal name. Midian means they come from the desert. Those nomads, like in Saudi Arabia and Jordan and other countries and Israel, still live there to this day. A lot of biblical customs. Again, I haven't time to share most of that with you, but they dress about the same. They look about the same. I like to think that Jesus probably looked a whole lot more like these people than he did like most of us. Still some interesting customs. Cover the face because that belongs to your husband or a man, whoever the man in your life is at that time if you're unmarried. Marry at 13 or 14. Typically the husbands have 4 wives. I like to think if that woman, if there wasn't that barrel in the background where the sheep were drinking out of, that could be Rebecca or Rachel. It's a good thing her husband didn't know I was taking the picture. Not too much changed. I was going to give you a bit of information about that, but I won't do that. One of the things that's fascinating, and those who've been to Israel and mingled with the Bedouin culture, which, by the way, really replicates what the Israelite culture was of Abraham and David and the Israelites wandering, is that the main occupation of those Bedouin is shepherding, and the shepherd work is done primarily by teenage girls or younger, or boys under 12. In fact, in the Bedouin nomad culture, I have never seen an adult male shepherd. The adult male will sit under a broom tree while his wife and kids take care of the sheep. Now think about that the next time you think about the Christmas program that you've seen. Notice how we always make the shepherds 35-year-old men with a beard and a stick. Honestly, I doubt it. The evidence is a whole lot more culturally significant that the shepherds of Christmas time were little girls, teenage girls, or little boys. Somehow that adds, to me, some impact. So you'll see the girls and little girls are the ones who take care of the sheep. Amazing to watch. Everyone by name. Couple things about shepherding that come out of the desert, and I'm going to have to skip this one too, because if I don't, I'll go over. One of the most significant biblical images that I've come across from the wilderness has to do with how the sheep are grazed on these desert hillsides in the Negev. Now just look at that for a minute. Now I don't know what your reaction is, but this slide is a picture that was taken in 1976. And that's a day that changed my life because of what's on this slide. We were hiking across the wilderness. It was a class. And I was one of very few Goy, very few Gentiles. Everybody else was Jewish in that particular class. And we were sleeping outside. And I woke up early in the morning. We had been sleeping in the shadow of a mighty rock. And I woke up early one morning, and coming up out of the wadi down below was a flock of mostly goats. Several little girls leading that flock. They were out in front calling, and the sheep were following. And I was laying there watching those goats and a few sheep in the early morning mist. And as I was laying there, a thought, and I'm slow, okay, a thought dawned on me. What do those things eat? Are those rock-eating sheep? I mean, seriously, what do you eat? So I looked over, and 2 or 3 people over from me, there was a young classmate, an Israeli, was laying there. He was yawning, and he was awake and looking too. So I turned to him, and I said, "What do those sheep eat?" And he laughed. They always laughed at me because I never could see the Eastern picture. And he then explained what happens in the desert. He said, "Look, during the daytime, it's 110, 120 degrees. It gets extremely hot. The rocks are hot. The dirt is hot. In the afternoon," and he's right, late in the afternoon, almost every day, you get a fairly strong west wind coming from the Mediterranean Sea about 35 miles away. The result is that moist, humid wind off the Mediterranean blows against the rocks that have been exposed to that hot sun. Enough water condenses, or enough moisture condenses on those stones. Sometimes small amounts of water are trapped under the stones from rainfall too, although it doesn't rain much here. And during the night, little tufts of grass grow out from those rocks. And I don't mean like huge clumps. I mean 4, 5, 6, 8 blades of grass will grow 4 or 5 inches in one night. And the next morning, the shepherd takes those sheep, takes them to a hillside that was exposed to the wind, where there are just enough of those little tufts of grass. Going the wrong way, I think. Sorry. Just enough of those little tufts of grass to provide, here it is, a mouthful of grass. And then you eat this one, and you eat this one, and then you move to the next one. And so shepherding is taking the sheep from one tuft to the next to the next. So I'm thinking about that, and I thought, that's incredible. I never heard anything like that. Sheep in my state don't look anything like that. They got a lot more grass than that. So I said to him, "What do you call this?" And he quoted to me, and I'll never forget it. It's like it was yesterday. He said, "The Lord leads me into green pastures." Now, I don't know if you'll believe me tonight. I get a bunch of questions in the question box, but I'm serious. This is what the Middle Easterner calls the green pastures of the shepherd. And the Israeli friend said to me, "You know, you Westerners think the green pastures of the shepherd are belly-deep alfalfa. And that when God takes you to green pastures, He plunks you down and you've got everything you need for the rest of your life. At least for a long time. And you just lay there and graze." He said to me, "Is that what life is like, being a Christian?" He said to me, "Do you have what it takes to handle the news you're going to get an hour from now?" I thought about that. And I had to honestly say to him, I could imagine a phone call telling me something that right now I don't think I could handle. And perish the thought, I'd like to have you think that same way. Why isn't this goat worried? Or this one? Or this one? All he's got, people, is one mouth of grass. One mouthful. But he's not worried because he has something else, or she. A shepherd. And as long as you have a shepherd, when the grass is gone that you need now, there will be more. But only just enough to deal with what's happening to you now. In a commentary on Psalm 23, "The Lord leads me into green pastures," a well-known rabbi wrote, "Worry is dealing with tomorrow's problems with today's green pastures." People, before God tonight, all God has ever promised us is green pastures. And that means all He's ever promised us is enough to deal with what is in your life right now. But if He is your shepherd, then whatever it is that comes into your life an hour from now or tomorrow, if you follow Him, there will be pastures adequate to what it is will happen tomorrow. Now, I don't think that says don't plan, don't deal with the future. I think it says that learning to trust, which is a desert picture totally, means can you live in such a way that you trust totally in what God has given you for this minute and let Him deal with providing what you'll need in the next minute. That is, I think, what we mean when we say the desert is the classroom of faith. All God ever promises us is green pastures. And that means all God ever promises us is enough to deal with now. And faith says, if I keep my eyes on the shepherd, then 10 minutes from now, there'll be new green pastures.